The night my father-in-law told me the house would be going to his son. His real son, he said. The one who'd grown up in it. I was the one who'd been paying the mortgage for 3 years. He didn't know that, of course. That was the whole problem. My name is Nadine Forrest. I'm 31 years old. I'm a senior project manager at a construction consultancy in Calgary, and I make good money. The kind of money you don't talk about at dinner tables in this country, because Canadians don't do that. You earn it quietly, you spend it carefully, and you absolutely do not sit across from your father-in-law at a Sunday roast and announce that you've been carrying this household since the spring of 2021. So I didn't. I smiled. I passed the potatoes. I thanked him for dinner, even though I'd bought the groceries. That was the version of me that existed until about 9:30 on a Tuesday evening in October, when my father-in-law, Gordon, sat down in the armchair I'd picked out from a shop on 17th Avenue and told me that he and my mother-in-law, Carol, had decided it was time to formalize some things. His youngest, my brother-in-law, Troy, had a new girlfriend. They were getting serious. The house, the one Gordon and Carol had lived in since 1989, the one my husband Callum and I had moved into 3 years ago to help out, as Carol had framed it, had 4 bedrooms. Troy and his girlfriend would need space. We were newlyweds, technically. Surely we'd want something of our own. He said it gently. Gordon always said difficult things gently. It was the family's way of making you feel like you were being offered something when they were actually taking something away. I looked at Callum. He was looking at the carpet. I said I'd think about it. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the part that came before it. When Callum and I got married, we had a plan. It wasn't romantic, but it was practical, which is probably why it felt like ours. His parents were aging. His dad had a bad hip that got worse every winter. His mum had been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis 2 years prior and was having trouble managing a 4-bedroom house on a street with an unshoveled driveway 6 months of the year. Callum is an only son. Troy is a decade younger, still in his 20s, working in trades. And Callum felt the pull of responsibility the way some people feel the cold. Constantly. Without being able to name exactly where it was coming from, I understood it. My own family is close. I didn't want to be the wife who pulled her husband away from his parents. So when Carol suggested, over the phone, that maybe we could all benefit from a living arrangement, us moving in, splitting costs, helping around the house, I said yes before I'd fully thought through what yes would mean. What yes meant, it turned out, was this. Callum's job in the trades meant his income was good but inconsistent. Feast months, famine months. Not the kind of income you could attach a mortgage payment to with any reliability. My income was salaried, predictable, direct deposit every second Friday, like clockwork. So when we sat down with the numbers, the mortgage balance, the utilities, the property tax, the home insurance, the maintenance fund, I'd quietly started, after the furnace needed replacing that first winter. It became clear, very quickly, that the arrangement would really only work if I was the one anchoring it. Gordon and Carol contributed what they could, a few $100s a month, sometimes more. But Gordon's pension wasn't enormous, and Carol had reduced her hours. What they contributed covered maybe a third of the actual monthly outlay on a good month. I covered the rest. At its peak, I was putting $500s and $200s a month into that household. Mortgage contribution. Utilities, gas, electricity, internet, water. The property tax installments. The new fence along the backyard that Gordon had been meaning to replace for 4 years. The kitchen renovation Carol mentioned once, casually, and then again, less casually. And then a third time while standing in front of the outdated cabinets, with a look on her face that I recognized as intent. I paid for the renovation, $43,000, financed partly through a home equity line that was, as it happened, in my name, because Callum's credit history had a gap from a rough patch in his mid-20s and the bank preferred mine. I told myself this was what partnership looked like. Not scorekeeping, not ledgers. Just 2 people building something together, and one of them happening to have a steadier hand on the finances for a while. I told Calcum what I was contributing, obviously. We talked about it. He said he'd make it up when his income stabilized. He meant it when he said it. I believed him when he said it. What I didn't fully account for was that some dynamics, once they set, don't unset. The way water finds a level and stays there. I had become the financial infrastructure of that household. And infrastructure, as anyone in construction will tell you, is only noticed when it fails. I want to be honest about something. I'm not a victim. I made choices, and I made them with open eyes, and I own that. What I didn't count on was the way the family's story about those choices would quietly rewrite itself over time. In Carol's telling, we were all just pitching in. A team, a family. As if the mortgage payment appeared each month through collective goodwill and not through my payroll account. In Gordon's telling, opening his home to us had been his generosity. He mentioned it sometimes when there was company. "We've always made space for family," he'd say. And I would smile and refill people's glasses because Canadians are polite and I am Canadian and that is what we do. Troy's telling was simpler. He barely had a telling at all. I was his brother's wife. She worked in an office somewhere. He saw me at Christmas. The only person in that house who knew the actual numbers was Callum. And Callum, over time, had developed an ability to be present for dinner and absent for difficult conversations that I hadn't noticed forming until it was already formed. So when Gordon sat in my armchair and told me, gently, that the house would be passing to Callum, and from Callum, presumably, to Troy when the time came, since that's how these things worked, and that perhaps Callum and I might like to start thinking about our own place, he wasn't being cruel. He was being exactly what he'd always been. A man who had never once looked at the bank statements. The house would be Callum's, and then Troy's, and I was being thanked for my time. That night, lying in the dark listening to Callum breathe, I thought about all the things I'd paid for that were in that house. The light fixture in the hallway, the bathroom tiles, the water softener Gordon had wanted for 15 years before I wrote the check. The apple tree we'd planted in the backyard that first spring because Carol said she'd always wanted one. I thought, they don't know what they're built on. And then something in me went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peace. The kind that's a decision. I didn't do anything rash. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect the dramatic version. Packing bags in the middle of the night, screaming in the kitchen, that kind of thing. That's not who I am. I've managed multi-million-dollar construction projects. I know how to plan. The morning after Gordon's announcement, I drove to work, sat at my desk, and pulled up every bank record I'd accumulated since we moved in. 3 years of mortgage contributions, utilities, the renovation, maintenance, incidentals. I built a spreadsheet that took me most of my lunch break and part of the afternoon. When the total appeared in the cell at the bottom of the column, I sat with it for a moment. Then I called a lawyer. His name was Mr. Balfour, and he specialized in family property law. I'd gotten his name from a colleague who'd been through a separation 2 years prior. He was efficient and unsentimental, which was exactly what I needed. I explained the situation. He asked questions. I sent him the spreadsheet and supporting documents. He called me back 2 days later. Here's what he told me, and I want to be precise because the details matter. In Alberta, contributions made by a spouse toward a matrimonial home, including mortgage payments, renovations, and documented maintenance costs, are considered when dividing matrimonial property. More interestingly, the home equity line of credit used to fund the kitchen renovation was registered in my name. I hadn't thought much about that at the time. I had now. Additionally, Mr. Balfour asked whether I'd ever seen the original title to the property. I hadn't. He suggested I obtain a copy. I drove to the land titles office on a Thursday afternoon and pulled the title. Gordon and Carol were listed as owners. Callum was not. Which meant that when Gordon casually mentioned the house would be going to Callum and then to Troy, he'd been talking about a future gift, not an existing arrangement. The house wasn't Callum's yet. It wasn't anyone's yet, and there was a HELOC registered against it with my name attached. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time after that. Then I called Mr. Balfour again. The thing about families like this one is that they operate on the assumption of continuity. Everything will keep going the way it's been going. The money will keep coming because it always has. The person providing it won't stop because she never has. The machinery of the household will hum along undisturbed because it always does. They had no idea I was about to shut it off. I gave myself 2 weeks to get organized. I found a condo, a rental, for now, in a building near my office in downtown Calgary. Bright unit, 12th floor, views of the mountains on a clear day. I signed the lease on a Friday. That weekend, I was at the house when Carol mentioned over breakfast that she was thinking of repainting the living room. She'd found a lovely grige on Pinterest. She wondered what I thought. I said it sounded nice. On Monday, I redirected my automatic payments, the mortgage contribution, the utility accounts that were linked to my bank, the HELOC, which I notified the bank I'd be managing differently going forward, the home insurance policy, which, and this I'd somehow never noticed, was actually in my name. I called the provider and moved it to a standalone policy on my new condo address. Then I wrote a very calm, very professional email to Gordon and Carol. No drama, no accusations, just facts. I wanted them to know that effective the following month, I'd be transitioning out of the household financial arrangements as I was moving into my own place. I wished them well. I said I hoped we could make the practical elements smooth. I CC'd Callum. He called me 7 minutes later. What is this? I was in my car in the parkade at work. I'd expected the call. I'd planned for it. I told him I was moving out, that I'd found a place, that I was happy to talk through the logistics. He said I was being dramatic. He said I'd caught everyone off guard. He said Mum is going to be upset. Not are you okay? Not I should have defended you. Just Mum is going to be upset. I said. I'm sure she will. He said he didn't understand what he'd done wrong. I said, I know, and I meant it. That was the part that was hardest to explain. Not that he'd done something terrible, but that he'd done almost nothing at all. He'd watched me pay and said, thank you when he remembered, and looked away when it was inconvenient. He'd chosen every single time there was a choice, the path of least resistance, which, it turned out, had led directly through me. I told him I'd be in touch. I hung up and sat with my hands in my lap for a moment. Then I went back to work. I moved out on a Saturday. I didn't own much that I'd brought into the marriage. My clothes, my books, my grandmother's quilt, the coffee maker I'd bought in my 20s, that was still the best one I'd ever used. What I owned in that house was the invisible kind, the equity, the receipts, the improvements woven into the walls. But there were a few things. The dining table, a solid maple one I'd found at a furniture place in Inglewood and paid $1,200 for, was mine. I had the receipt. I brought it with me, the standing bookshelf in the home office, mine. Bought it the 1st December after we moved in, because Callum needed somewhere to put his work binders and the house didn't have one. A few smaller things. The good pot I'd bought for the kitchen because the one Carol had was warped and burned everything. My tools, which lived in the garage and which Gordon had sometimes borrowed without asking. I arranged for a small moving truck, just a couple of guys for a few hours, and we were done by noon. I drove to my new building, watched them carry things up to the 12th floor, and stood at my window, eating a sandwich from the place downstairs, looking at the city. It was the first time in 3 years I hadn't felt like a guest in my own life. The calls started that afternoon. First Callum, then Carol, then, which surprised me a little, Gordon, who I'd never once seen initiate a phone call to me in 3 years. I let them all go to voicemail. I ordered dinner from a Thai place around the corner. I ate it sitting on the floor because I didn't have a couch yet, and I watched the sun go down over the river valley, and I felt something uncurl in my chest that I hadn't realized was coiled. I listened to the voicemails the next morning. Callum said we needed to talk, that this was fixable, that he loved me. Carol said she didn't understand what was happening, that she hoped we could be adults about this. Gordon said, and I'll remember this one for a long time, that he thought I was making a mistake, that this family had welcomed me, that if I had concerns about finances, I could have raised them. I listened to that one twice. Then I forwarded the spreadsheet to all three of them. Just the spreadsheet, no message, no subject line. The numbers laid out in 12-point Arial, organized by month with a total at the bottom that I'll give you here. $187,400. That's what I'd put into that household across 3 years, not counting my own labor or my time or the mental load of managing a property that was never going to be mine. I also forwarded the document from Mr. Balfour's office outlining the HELOC situation. The calls, after that, stopped for a while. By the following week, I started to understand what 3 years of invisible infrastructure actually looked like when it disappeared. The mortgage payment that I'd been contributing to, the bulk of it, didn't arrive that month. Gordon called the bank. He discovered, apparently for the first time, how much the actual monthly payment was. This information seemed to be a surprise. The home insurance policy had lapsed when I moved it. They hadn't had their own policy. It had always been mine, and I'd never thought to mention it, and neither had anyone else, because no one had ever thought to ask. The HELOC, the one registered in my name against the property, wasn't going anywhere without my cooperation. Mr. Balfour had sent a formal letter explaining that I'd be seeking reimbursement for documented contributions before releasing my interest in the equity line. Troy called me once. He was friendlier than I expected, which made it worse somehow. He said he didn't want things to be weird. I said I didn't either. He said his dad was pretty stressed. He said, "Did you really pay for all of it?" I said, "Yes," he said. "Wow." And then, after a pause, "Callum didn't say anything," I said. "No, he didn't." There was a long silence. Then Troy said, "That's messed up." He sounded like he meant it. It was the only genuine acknowledgement I got from anyone in that family, and it came from the person they were supposedly making space for. Callum came to see me at the condo 3 weeks after I moved out. He buzzed from the lobby. I let him up. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. His jacket was the one he'd had since before we were married, the gray one with the broken zipper he'd never gotten around to fixing, and seeing it made me feel something complicated that I pushed to the side. He sat on the floor with me. I'd gotten a chair by then, but only one, and I gave him the chair and sat on my folded-up moving blanket. And he said he'd been thinking. He said, "I didn't realize how much you were carrying." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have paid more attention." I said, "Yes." He asked if there was a way back from this, and I thought about it, genuinely. I sat with the question instead of answering it immediately, which is something I've learned to do. I thought about the years of looking at the carpet, the phone calls where I was the one managing the awkwardness, the Sunday evenings when his parents had opinions about how the house should run, and he'd smile and nod and leave me to navigate it alone. The moment when his father had told me I'd be moving along, and he hadn't said a single word, I thought about all the ways a person can be present and absent simultaneously. I said, "I don't know yet, but I know that I can't go back to what it was." He nodded. He turned the broken zipper pull over in his fingers. He said he understood. We sat quietly for a minute. The building made the sounds buildings make. A door somewhere, an elevator, the muffled bass of someone's television. He asked if I needed anything. I said I was okay. He left. I sat at my window for a long time after. I want to tell you about the part that came later, the part I didn't plan for, because the plan I'd made was really just about stopping the payments, stopping the silence, stopping the particular kind of shrinking I'd been doing for 3 years. I hadn't thought much past that. What I hadn't anticipated was the legal detail Mr. Balfour surfaced 2 months into the process. When the kitchen renovation had been financed through the HELOC, and the contractor had registered the work against the property for warranty purposes, the registered address had my name on the primary account documents. More than that, because of the way the municipal renovation permits had been pulled, in both my name and Gordon's, because I'd been the one managing the contractor, and they'd needed a second signature. There was a question of whether I held a documented financial interest in the improvements. It wasn't ownership. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't claiming the house. Mr. Balfour was measured about what could and couldn't be pursued, and I trusted his judgment. But it meant that when Gordon and Carol went to their own lawyer to understand their options, which they did, because of course they did, the picture was more complicated than they'd expected. They couldn't simply sell the house and pass the proceeds to Callum without first resolving the HELOC and addressing my documented financial claims. I wasn't trying to take anything from them. I'd decided, by that point, what I actually wanted. Reimbursement for a portion of my contributions, not all of it, just the piece that Mr. Balfour felt was cleanly documentable, and to be released from any connection to the property going forward. Gordon called me himself to discuss it. Not Carol, Gordon. He was quieter than I'd ever heard him. He said, "We didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "Callum should have told us." I said, "Yes, he should have." Gordon said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't say anything for a moment because I hadn't expected that. Gordon is not a man who apologizes. I've known him for 6 years and I'd never heard him say that word in that way. I said thank you. He said I meant it, you know. About welcoming you. I said, I know, and I think I did know actually. That's the complicated part. They hadn't been cruel people, they'd been incurious ones. There's a difference, and it matters. And it doesn't make any of it okay, but it matters. We worked out an agreement through the lawyers. It took about 8 weeks. The number we settled on was less than what the spreadsheet showed and more than what they could easily afford. And we structured it in a way that was manageable for all of us. The HELOC was discharged. My name came off everything connected to that property. I drove home from Mr. Balfour's office on a Wednesday afternoon in February. The sky was the particular shade of blue you get in Alberta in winter. The one that looks almost fake, it's so clear, and the mountains were showing through on the horizon like they do when the Chinooks is coming. I got back to my condo, made tea, stood at the window. I'm writing this down because I think there's something in it worth naming, not as a cautionary tale exactly, but as something more honest than that. I loved Callum. I think I still do. In the way you continue to love someone even as you're understanding clearly that the shape of the thing you had isn't going to hold. We're in therapy now, separately, not together, and we talk sometimes. And there is something between us that isn't finished, but I don't know yet what it will become. What I know is that I can't figure that out while also being the financial foundation of a structure built on the assumption that I'll always say yes. What I know is that my name matters in documents, in conversations, in rooms where decisions are being made about my life. What I know is that people will accept what you offer without asking what it costs you, not because they're monsters, but because they're human. And humans are very good at not looking directly at the price of their own comfort. And what I know is this: I was not pushed out of that family. I walked out on my own schedule with my own things and took my name off everything that wasn't mine to carry anymore. The apple tree is still in the backyard. Carol sends me a photo of it every spring when it blooms, which I didn't expect. I send back a short message. It's a small kindness, and I think we're both surprised by it. Callum fixed the zipper on that jacket. He told me about it on the phone like it was a significant thing, and maybe it was. I don't know yet how the rest of it turns out, but I live in a place that's entirely mine now. The rent, the furniture, the light in the mornings, the view of the mountains, and nothing in it requires my silence to survive. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually.